Hello, it's time for another edition of Korean Politics Debrief with me, Jang-Ho. It's now been over a month since Lee Jae Myung became president, and so far, it's been mostly smooth sailing. There haven't been any major mishaps or scandals. He hasn't made any gaffes or controversial remarks. It seems we are still very much in the honeymoon period. Now, if we go over some developments since the last podcast, Kim Min-seok has been appointed Prime Minister. None of the controversies that we mentioned last time were resolved in any way, such as suspicious finances, allegations involving his son, that he might have helped him get into an internship, etc. But ultimately, they weren't big enough to derail his nomination. Even the polls showed that the public weren't too fussed, so he has now become the Prime Minister. Before his appointment, he held a press conference marking 30 days in office. Now, substance-wise, there wasn't much, to be honest. 30 days is really not long enough to have made any sort of a real impact. It felt more like an extension of his presidential campaign, laying out what he's gonna do rather than what he has done. So there wasn't much to talk about, especially for 2 hours. But he did manage to do two things in my books. So first, this was the earliest that a president held this kind of formal official press conference in their term. And by doing that, he essentially sent out a message that he's not afraid of the press and the public, and that we will look to communicate more. Now, while his predecessor, Yoon Suk-yeol, did initially try to embrace the press as well, holding daily news briefings on the way to work, he eventually shunned them when he felt especially that the press had turned against him. He became more distant than ever, even going to war with some of the media outlets. So this was more like a reset, essentially, a press conference to show as soon as possible that things are back on track and back to normal. Now, the second thing he managed to achieve was that he managed to get through the 2 hours without making any gaffes and causing unintentional headlines. That became such a prominent feature of Yoon's press conferences, especially towards the end, such as apologies that weren't really apologies, or explanations about his wife's behaviour that made things even worse. Lee's press conference was a success by simply not saying anything particularly controversial. That might be a low bar to clear, but that is the yardstick that we are currently measuring Lee on at the moment because of his predecessor, and he cleared it without too many issues, it seems. One more note on the style of the press conference. So he went out of his way to show that he wanted to be closer to the press. So there was no podium or stage. He was sat at a table on the same level as the reporters, just a few yards away from them as well. And he tried to show that he was choosing reporters or questions at random as well. There was even this box where reporters had placed their business cards in so that their names could be picked out for questions at random, like a raffle or something. He even invited press that are not usually part of the presidential office press pool, which is why a freelance reporter like Rafael Rashid, a previous guest on this pod, managed to get a seat in the room as well. So he wanted to show that he was more open and doing things differently. But I would suggest a couple of things. So 2 hours for a press conference marking 30 days in office, as I mentioned, was just too long. There wasn't enough really to talk about. I think moving forward, shorter, more informal press conferences, which happen more often, would be more effective. And along with that, I think having him standing would be better as well, like they do in the US at the White House with the US presidents. There is something more commanding, but also I think just a bit more natural and less formal about a leader who's standing by a podium rather than sitting at a table. It just felt a bit stiff. And I'd also just get him to pick reporters who hold their hands up. I understand that he wanted to show transparency and fairness, but having that box and picking out names I think was silly and added faff. And finally, by having shorter press conferences more often, it would also ease the expectation on these sorts of press conferences. These press conferences marking 100 days or 1 year or halfway points in their term, they've become such an event, weighed down with expectation. People almost expect too much, I feel, and it becomes so stiff and formal. Shorter, more frequent press conferences, please, in my books. And while that might increase the risk for E, I think that would also play to E's strengths as well. Now, aside from that, let's look at a couple of other recent achievements and developments by the E administration. The government passed the supplementary budget, which includes so-called consumption coupons, essentially cash handouts to the public. Everyone will get at least 150,000 won, which is about 100 US dollars. And the most economically vulnerable will get up to 550,000 won, which is about 400 US dollars. Now, while there are plenty of fair economic arguments that say such handouts don't really work, that they only have a very limited boost in consumer spending, and that ultimately people don't spend that much more than they would have. Still, I don't think it was perhaps as controversial as people might have expected, because it's what people expect from Lee Jae Myung. He is known as the universal basic income politician, so the public are generally going along with it at the moment, it seems. I mean, who doesn't like free cash at the end of the day? But again, I think the lack of backlash also shows how much of a honeymoon period he is still in as well, and people are giving him the benefit of the doubt for now, despite more government spending. The other big thing that he did recently is slamming the brakes on the overheating real estate market with unexpectedly swift and stringent measures as well. So since E took office, house prices, or I should say more accurately, apartment prices, started to pick up speed, and it was starting to accelerate at a rate that was approaching alarming. But then suddenly the administration announced a cap on real estate loans, 600 million won max. That's around 440,000 US dollars. And it kicked in essentially as soon as it was announced as well, the next day, I believe. This caught everyone by surprise, and suddenly people who were thinking about buying, especially those buying to invest speculatively, had nowhere to go. And it seemed to have worked. The pace of price increases has slowed since then, and a message has been sent by the E administration that he will be cracking down on this issue hard. But ultimately, this is just a sort of slamming on the brakes measure for now. It doesn't resolve more fundamental issues plaguing the real estate market, but it does stop the bleeding for now. How he handles the real estate issue is going to be one of the biggest tests for him as a president. Remember, many blamed Moon Jae-in's failed real estate policies for being the number one reason that E and the party lost the 2022 presidential election to Yoon. The party and the supporters still really have nightmares about that. So there is going to be extra scrutiny on real estate policies. One way he is trying to tackle that is by offering other outlets for people to invest, such as the stock market. He keeps saying that he wants to see the Kospi, the main stock price index in South Korea, to reach 5,000 points, up from its current level of only 3,000 points, which would be, of course, a huge increase. So while that might be a stretch, the market has been rallying pretty well since he took office, so they seem to be responding all right. Meanwhile, the DP has also floated support for things like stablecoin cryptocurrencies, although that's probably a long way away. So these are all initiatives linked to the real estate situation as well. So that is something we're going to have to watch over the next 5 years of his presidency. Okay, so let's get into our interview this week, and it's part 2 of our conversation with the law professor Se-ryun from Kyunghee University. Now, last time it was mostly about the election and the new Lee Jae Myung administration. This time, it's about the other side of the political aisle. We'll be discussing the future of the People Power Party and conservative party politics in Korea more generally, because they appear to be in a crisis at the moment. A recent poll had their approval rating at 19%, which is in fact even lower than when Yoon had declared martial law and he was being impeached. So they are really in a difficult place at the moment. And I just wanted to explore where they're going to go from here more with Professor Song. So here is the interview. Once again, it was recorded on the 16th of June. Okay, now for this second half of the interview, I won't keep it too long because I've taken up a lot of your time already. But I wanted to talk to you about the losers in the election, the People Power Party and the Conservative faction, essentially, because the party is facing a critical juncture at the moment indeed. They've lost the presidency, they were the party of martial law, and now they are in opposition. Barely over 100 seats in the National Assembly, meaning that they barely have any legislative power. Let's start with the election result first. What did you make of the election result and Kim Mun-soo's loss?
Well, because of the martial law declaration, which was so outrageous to many voters in Korea, I thought they were almost unelectable unless they have some big reforms, a big statement saying that they turned the page, and that did not happen. And they had the candidate who was just sort of, sympathetic to the president to an extent. So even without that, they were in a losing party. But their election results just speaks louder. I think that they garnered more votes than they deserve. Because of the two-party dynamics.
Do you think Prime Minister Han Duck-soo would have done any better?
I think he would have lost too, but his proposition is that he was not really privy to all the excessive actions. But then a lot of people said, hey, you were the prime minister under that regime, so how clean can you be? So I think the result would have been the same. It would have been marginally better in terms of resume-wise than Mr. Kim Mun-soo, but I think the result would not be different.
Why do you think the PPP was so unwilling and unable to turn the page and leave behind Yoon Sang-yeol?
Well, it's hard to leave the president in your party, right? And if the president in some way retains his power, then you're subject to his whims and the power he willed. So at this point, I think a lot of people think that he still has some power. I don't understand that. He was impeached and he cannot run for any presidency, and he didn't have the party faction in the first place.
Well, I guess it's not his personal power, but it's the people behind the scenes who were supporting him. The pro-Yoon faction, as such, they're still around the party. They're still in senior positions within the party. They're still influencing things, it seems.
Yeah, pro-Yoon, but what do they gain? I mean, by sticking with the presidency. I think it's a kind of the shadow effect where he's going out, but his shadow still remains, and you think that the shadow has a meaning to it. I don't believe that. He is historically kind of certified as a very bad president, and he didn't have a political base in the first place. Those people who surrounded him at this point, I think, is there almost as inertia of things. Just because there isn't any credible accumulated the challenge or power coming from other side of the PP party.
I guess the argument would be that their conservative base are still quite behind President Yoon. That their supporters, the party supporters, they've come to believe now that perhaps it wasn't such a bad thing that President Yoon declared martial law. How do you believe that they believe that? And do you think that group is significant enough for the party not to be able to change?
Well, their logic is that, well, those are the extreme right faction, the asphalt protest faction, there's the older generations, and they always come out to vote. So,
Is that the majority of the party, do you think?
No, it's not. I think that the extremism or the too much on the right side was a problem before and is a problem now. Well, of course, as time goes by, it's going to dissipate. But I think it's a big mistake for the People's Party to sympathize with that waning power, and because of that, not very diligent in proposing the future visions of Korea. I think that they're stuck in a way that because these extreme factions have some influence by voting, they think that having that much influence is a good thing, if anything else, because it's, a lot of times a pro-Yoon faction, they only have that and nothing else. So they're making a kind of notional mistake that they're not taking care of the future, just hanging on to what they can visibly see at this point. But I think it's a losing proposition. Now, the PP party was in shambles before they borrowed the Yoon Suk-yeol from the other side, so to speak, and kind of put the life support. And of course, that spectacularly failed. Now they're back to their shamble days. And I say shamble days to point out that they didn't present what conservatism is in Korea and what kind of visions they present and what kind of political viability they have. They have to rebuild. They have to kind of build it from ground up. But because of Yoon Suk-yeol coming in and becoming the president, they said, okay, we don't have to do it now. Well, they're back to the position at this point, and without major reforms, probably the conservative force in Korea is still a very, very weak force at this point.
Okay, so that's my question. Where do you think the election result leaves the PPP now? Do you think that they are in a position where they are going to reform, or is the fact that they can't seem to decide this?
Well,
is that the issue at the moment?
The dilemma is, I think people in the PP party knows this. In order to have a major party again, they need the reform. But those people who are in the seats, who are the National Assemblymen, they're usually from the very narrow sector in Korea, the southeast portion, and they're sitting there pretty, right? They'll be voted again because that's a red country. So I think the urgency is there, but because their seats are pretty secure, people are not rustling the feathers.
So people the lawmakers within the PPP, because they're primarily from conservative strongholds, the majority of the lawmakers in the National Assembly now, there's no urgency for them to reform the party, because as long as they keep their seats safe and their jobs safe, they don't care about the party, you say?
Right. I think that it's a very irresponsible thing to do, and that's why the generational change, I think, is important. Those people who are now regionally based, not the location based, but in terms of generations, they're looking to the problems that they have or the problems they'll face in the future. Those should be the basis of their agenda. Those should be the policies they come up with, not the power base that they had for decades and decades.
You say that, but as I said, the people in power are those people from those regions. And so therefore, there's not a lot of room for change, right? Like they are going to essentially, just as long as they stay in power, this is going to get worse, isn't it?
I think that this election and the past elections, and just immediate past election as well, I think even the people in that location, that Gyeongsang and Yeongnam location, they begin to say that, well, with this kind of setup in the party, it's hard to expect the president to come out.
Not just a president, for a majority in the National Assembly.
Right. So the power base is very regional, very localized. And as they realize this, I think that they, as a voter, they'll look to alternatives and what the future, power should be.
So this is my question. Isn't Korean conservatism in crisis at the moment? Because it is so regional based and it's so age based. The majority of their supporters are people in their 70s, 80s and plus. And to be frank, they're only going to be around for only so many more years. So once that generation starts dying out, there's no one coming up below the younger generations. So what happens to Korean conservatism then?
Well, that's the thing. As I said, they were in shambles for quite a long time because they couldn't come up with the vision for conservatism in Korea. And in turn, they couldn't come up with it because they had the strong waning base with the older generations who would come out passionately because of their memories of Korean War and the industrialization. That scene is changing, I think. That's why they're realizing that, this is not sustainable and this is too much to the right. And without having a sustainable and future-oriented conservative visions, we cannot really hold on to any power on a national scale. So, as you said, the conservatism has been in doldrums for quite a while. I think that President Yoon Suk-yeol did a very disservice to the conservatism by becoming president and putting off the reform agenda, and then spectacularly crashing and giving a very big black mark to the conservatism. If they're going to turn this crisis into an opportunity, I think that, as people would say, the PP should, just like Phoenix would go out, they have to crash and burn very badly, which they did with the election. They have to build themselves up from their ground zero. That's why the generational change has some relevance to that logic, and that's why those voters who have a strong grip on the very extreme side, they're, sorry to say, getting older, dying out, and it's a waning power. I mean, their glory was about decades ago, and change has to come.
But that refresh, starting from scratch, that could take, to generate like 20 years?
I don't think so. My hope is that the next election, if we have a sizable number of, not only the generational change, but the ideologically, those moderates become the mainstay of the power and have a voice and not be afraid of somebody sending them the mail bombs or anything. I think that could become a pretty strong core to rebuild and have some, voice as to what kind of conservatism do we need. I think that has to do with how Lee Jae Myung government does. If he doesn't do well, I think the conservatives would be an opportunity or the risk. But they'll say, well, we went through Moon Jae-in government, or we went through Lee Jae Myung government. They say they had good intentions, liberal, but the result is that the Korea was not served well. I think that the conservatism, in that sense, are more realistic in their policies And if they have some good policy mixes, they can back up the conservative visions in Korea. That probably the voters will give them a chance.
So it would have to rest on, though, then the Lee Jae Myung government not doing well, having problems.
Sorry to say that Korean politics has been in that mode for quite some time. You get opportunity simply because the other guy screwed it up, right? And the Yoon Suk-yeol case was the same, Moon Jae-in case was the same, and the Park Geun-hye case was the same. But I think we have to turn this around, where the politics has to be a contest of policies and visions, rather than waiting to see other guy just falling flat on their face. I think that kind of passion and that kind of energy comes from, in my mind, the younger generations. That's why I keep saying the generation change is a very crucial in Korean politics future.
Do you think Lee Jun-suk might be the answer? Do you think the PPP should try to bring Lee Jun-suk and the Reform Party back into the party?
Well, Lee Jun-suk is a very kind of visible figure at this point. But if he's by himself in the generation, I don't think he's going to be as effective. We have an army of the young generation politicians. We don't have to focus on Lee Jun-suk going forward. It could be somebody else, right? And sharing the roles, and if they are sharing the visions, probably this is predictable. We won't like it. We, as in the older generations, will not like the younger generation politicians. Oh, they're egotistical. They only take care of themselves. But hey, that's what we did when we were in the majority of the society. So it's going to be painful, but that changing of the guard, the turning off the page, that has to happen, and we have to kind of take it as a parents would see in a bitter sense the kids going up and going up against them.
I just have this issue with the demographic issue. I think is such a big hurdle for the Conservatives at the moment, because, as I said, their current support base are people in the core is people in their 70s and plus, but the people who are now in their 50s and 60s, they're going to grow up, continue to be around for a lot longer, and therefore they are very fervently DP supporters, more liberal. And for the younger generation, it's far more mixed, I think, 20s. Obviously, the men are more conservative, the women are far more liberal. So I don't see where conservatives, where the PPP or whatever party they might be in the future, where they get their support from.
I mean, that's the fair assessment. I get your...
Because it's so generational. Because the 70s and 80s are so conservative. And then the people in the 50s and 60s in Korea at the moment are so liberal. But then there's so many of them. That's the baby boomer generation and Gen X and whatnot. But yeah.
As we talked about, the people's motivation to stay with one side, a lot of times it's not because they're excited about this side, but because they simply hate too much of the other side, right? That dynamic is one. Second, I think that if you look at the voting patterns of 20s and 30s, the fact that they are more engaged to the political process, and those people who are more engaged in the older generation, they're kind of in the waning side. That would kind of change the scene in Korea. I think that the quick succession of the president, because of impeachment, switching from conservative side and the liberal side, and how those politics were dominated by the kind of individual influence in Mr. Lee Jae Myung and also Yoon Suk-yeol. I think generated not only the fatigue, but the better alternative. I think that the Lee Jae Myung's 8 point somewhat percent, not spectacular, but it is an indication that even even those people who just turned 40 can have an influence. That is an indication and gives hope to other the younger generation politicians to come up and become a more of a power. The change, you say 20, 30 years, but I think it's going to be a lot quicker. And in order to do that, I think one of the reforms that needs to happen is not the National Assemblyman, but those the councilmen and those representatives in the municipal government. I think the voting schedule has to align with the national elections. What I want to see is that those people who start from a small government representatives, they come up bigger and bigger so that when they become a national assemblyman, they have all kinds of experiences and knowledges on a local base and bring that up to the national stage and become very experienced and very rational about having a vision for the whole nation. And that's not happening these days.
Right.
A lot of national assemblymen comes from the government sector because they spent a lot of time as a civil servant and they were, in a good side of the leader who can dish out those nominations. So if the party system can be changed in that way, I think it's we have a lot shorter time of changing the political culture in Korea.
Sure, but in the short term, you would need leadership that is conducive to that, who welcomes that. Is there a risk, you think, that the People Power Party could split or even essentially almost disintegrate with all the infighting at the moment? Or do you think it will survive as the main party?
Well, I don't think it can survive as a people's power and the current setup. In a kind of diabolical way, if they split up, maybe that's an opportunity to crystallize what this split group want and to see whether they are viable, split, and maybe become, in an earnest way, build a big tent, not just for the electional dynamics, but to work with together in a way. I think we see that kind of dynamism in other countries where a lot of the split parties kind of work together, either to become just one party or have a network of parties who kind of have the same voting patterns. I think both will work in a diversified society, as we're talking about. Different interests needs to be expressed in different forms and different venue.
I don't think I'm very hopeful for the Conservatives, especially when it comes to local and general elections. I think for presidential elections, because it's based around a single figure and it's a judgment on the previous administration. If the previous administration does badly, then I believe that the other side could win an election. That there's enough swing moderate voters in Korea who will judge the past administration rather than look at the next guy. But when it comes to local and general elections, I feel because it's so regional and so based in that way, that they're going to continue to lose, the Conservative parties, for a long time.
Well, you'll have that dynamics in the pockets of Korea, like, southeast and the Cholla areas. But the local elections, especially, the preference for the party is less because you're so engrossed in the local agenda. I think the local elections is the opportunity for the opposition parties to make some headways and be a power base to begin with. I think that is not really happening these days because the career path of the politicians is starting from local elections to the National Assembly. That's not aligned at this point. So even if you become the local representatives, you have to kind of jump through some hoops to be a national figure. So I think if you make that easier for the budding politicians, I think that the change would be quicker. Pessimism, yes, because of the regionalism, but I think over the years we are seeing some erosions in the regionalism, especially in the Busan area, Yeongnam areas in pockets. So the disintegration of, hopeful way, not just looking at the regional candidates, probably that could change the Korean politics in a very different ways.
Finally, just some advice you would give to the PPP leadership, especially on how to handle the current situation of being in opposition with a minority of seats in the National Assembly.
Well, I think that they should look back upon what has happened to PP Party over the last 10 years or so. Beholden to the certain factions of the party, and even if we borrow a candidate from somewhere else, that usually is not a good thing. I think that the real reform has to happen to guarantee any kind of future for the party. So I think this is a time to say, well, we lost anyway, so we have some time, and this is a time for reform, and earnest reform, strong reform, and making a big vision for the conservatism in Korea. If it's going to happen, this is the time to do it.
Okay, well, Professor Song, I feel like I could continue talking with you for hours about some of these subjects, but I really should let you go now and get on with your day. But it's been a real pleasure. Thank you for indulging me answering all these questions today. And yeah, we'll hopefully speak to you again soon.
All right, my pleasure. It was fun.
So that was Professor Song, pinning the future hopes of conservative politics on the younger generation. But I do feel that perhaps Professor Song is a bit optimistic and idealistic because there is currently no real sign of that happening at the moment, and it was further cemented in recent weeks as well. So during the election, the People Power Party put in a very interesting figure as their interim chief. They put a 34-year-old rookie, first-term National Assemblyman Kim Yong-tae as their interim leader. This was a rather blunt attempt to show that the party was turning a new leaf, appealing to more moderate and younger voters, especially because he was anti-Yoon and pro-impeachment. But it never sat easy, considering that most of the party and the presidential candidate himself, Kim Moon-soo, were still pro-Yoon and anti-impeachment, even if they weren't saying it out loud. So after the election, while usually a party chief would step down, taking responsibility for an election loss, Kim didn't, and he essentially said that he is still the future of the party. In fact, he soon came out with a list of 5 major reform measures, which included rejecting the party's official stance of opposing Yoon's impeachment, investigating how the party tried to forcibly nominate Han Deok-soo as its candidate, and a bottom-up system of nominations for local elections as well. However, he was largely ignored by the party. His reform measures fell to the wayside. The party refused to extend his term past June 30th, and another pro-Yoon figure, the floor leader Song Eun-seok, took over as the interim party chief. So any hopes of young blood, new blood coming over to shake up the party died right there and then. There was small hope that perhaps there could be change. An Chol-soo, another lawmaker, this time older though, But he was also very anti-Yoon, pro-impeachment, and an outsider in the party, really. He only joined the party in 2022. He was chosen to lead the party's innovation committee to try and bring about reforms in the wake of the election loss. But less than a week later, he also quit the committee, saying that the party leadership refused to let him pick the people he wanted for the committee, that they were trying to force too many pro-Yun figures onto the committee. So he quit, and another more pro-Yun figure took his place instead. This pro-Yun establishment faction are refusing to let go of the party reins. And amid this situation, as I mentioned earlier, their approval ratings has continued to plummet, falling to 19% now, which is lower than at any point during the martial law and impeachment saga. I mean, that is saying a lot. But despite that, it seems the party hasn't learned any lessons yet, or is refusing to learn any lessons, because maybe, as Professor Song said, they haven't maybe reached rock bottom yet. Unbelievably, it seems there might be more bottom to go. That bottom could come next year in the local elections, but I feel like it might come more during the general elections in 2028, where I fear they're going to struggle to even keep the 100 or so National Assembly seats that they have currently out of the 300 seats in total. And if they get less than 100, that means the DP and their allies can push through constitutional change without any resistance. That is going to be something that's going to be massive to see. Whether the Conservative Party can get their act together enough to even keep 100 seats in the National Assembly in 2028, I think that is going to be key. There's a phrase in Korean that a bird needs two wings to fly, that politics on both the left and the right need to be strong and healthy for the nation to progress. And while I do feel the fear-mongering from the right over an Lee Jae Myung presidency is overblown, I do feel there needs to be a healthy Conservative Party or Conservative politics for the good of the nation, for there to be balance. But for now, it does feel like the nation is going to be flying with just one wing for quite some time. Okay, that's it for another edition of Korean Politics Debrief. I hope you enjoyed it. I've got a really interesting interview with a guest coming up soon as well, someone who was directly involved in Korean politics and even worked with the Moon administration. That'll be coming soon, so do look out for that. In the meantime, if you have any suggestions, feedback, or questions you wanted answered on the pod, just find me on X or Blue Sky or email at koreanpoliticsdebrief@gmail.com. Thank you once again for listening or watching, and I hope you join me again next time. Till then, take care.